Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our first session of the PBBI FLAD speaker series at Fresno State for the spring of 2021. As we begin another semester at Fresno State and our spring semester for 2021, as all of you know, continues to be virtual. So our PBBI events are virtual as well. Thank you all for joining us on the Zoom webinar. Thanks to the students and some of the members of the faculty as well and staff at Fresno State. And thanks to all of you who are joining us. And we're receiving some comments, which is great. Thanks to all of you who are joining us through Facebook as well. Remember, you can follow us on Facebook at the Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute Facebook page, the group, and all of the other pages that allow us to post. We are very happy to be with you once again, and welcome. And we are excited about this lecture. It is, as we say in Portuguese, we are going to kick it off, dar o pontapé de saída em termos futebolísticos and soccer terms with chave de ouro. Is how you close it, but this time we're going to open it with a chave de ouro. We are very, very excited to have Professor Robert Newcomb from the University of California at Davis. Welcome, Professor. And we'd like to a little bit about his background, and we are so excited about this presentation. And once again, thank you all for joining us. So Professor Robert Patrick Newcomb is a PhD in Luso-Brazilian Studies from the prestigious Brown University, where he received his PhD in 2008. He is a professor of Luso-Brazilian Studies in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at the University of California, Davis. His research and teaching focuses on comparative approaches to the literatures of the Portuguese and Spanish-speaking worlds. His publications include the books Nossa and Nuestra América, Inter-American Dialogues from Purdue, published in 2011, and Iberianism in Crisis, Spain and Portugal at the turn of the 20th century, published in Toronto in 2018, and edited the volumes Beyond Tordesilhas, New Approaches to Comparative Luso-Hispanic Studies, along with Richard Gordon, Ohio State, in 2013, and Transatlantic Studies, Latin America, Iberia, and Africa, with Cecilia Hutu Rangel, Pedro Garcia Caro, and Sebastian Feder from Liverpool in 2019, and a book-length translation of Brazilian cultural critic Alfredo Bossi's Brazil and the Dialect of Colonization, published in 2015. Welcome, Professor Newcomb. We are so happy to have you along, and thank you for your time, and thank you for this wonderful presentation that we are excited to hear. Many of us who have contacted me who said they were going to register, many of the folks interested in obviously in the connection, and many of them are fans of our Azorian Antero de Quental. So we're happy to have that connection with this strong community down here that has a very strong basis, as you know, in the archipelago. Thank you again. We appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to thank Denise Borges. Denise, thank you so much for having me, Director of the Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute, as well as the FLAD, the Luso-American Development Foundation. In 2005, when I was a graduate student at Brown, I received a grant from FLAD to conduct research in Lisbon, and that was one of the really formative steps for me in developing my research interest in the work of Antero de Quental. So it's nice once again to be able to revisit that early research and to continue developing it with our neighbors and friends at Fresno State. I'm going to begin, for those of you who are maybe less familiar with the work of Antero de Quental and the Spanish writer Miguel de Unamuno, with a little biographical background in the form of a PowerPoint, just a couple of slides. Then I will turn share screen off and read my paper. It's really a section of a paper. And then depending on the amount of time left, I can share some of the poems themselves. I do want to let everyone know that I'm here in my office at UC Davis, and it is quite possible that at some point I will lose my internet connection. If that happens, I will log back on within 1 or 2 minutes. So I apologize in advance for any disruption that may occur. But without further ado, I will get started. So let me just open up that and go to share screen. There we are. I'm going to.
Perfect.
Okay. So a little bit about Antero de Quental. Antero de Quental, for those in the audience less familiar with the work of this very important Portuguese writer, was born in 1842 in Ponta Delgada, on the island of São Miguel in the Azores. And he died in São Miguel in 1891. He's best known as a poet, a philosopher, and political activist. He's also one of the principal innovators of the sonnet form in Portuguese, and really responsible for revolutionizing that form during the 19th century. He spent most of his life in continental Portugal. He was educated at the University of Coimbra and subsequently lived in Lisbon. He's remembered in terms of his place in Portuguese literature as a member and really the spiritual guide, I would say, of the Geração de 70, the generation of 1870. This is a famous intellectual grouping for those familiar with Portuguese literature in general that includes really important names like the novelist Essa de Queiroz, the poet Guerra Junqueiro, and the historian Oliveira Martins. To give you a sense of his personality and reputation, he was referred to by Essa de Queiroz, one of his friends, as Santo Antero, Saint Antero. And so there was always something spiritual or religious about him, as we'll see. Curiously, he defended Iberianism, which we can define succinctly as the cultural and political approximation between Portugal and Spain. Early in his career, this was a very controversial political opinion that is beyond the scope of this presentation today, but it's something that I've written about elsewhere in my work. He suffered from depression throughout what today we would probably describe as clinical depression throughout his life, and eventually succumbed to that depression and died by self-inflicted gunshot on a park bench in Ponta Delgada in 1891. So he had a tragic end to his really storied life. Miguel de Unamuno was born in 1864. He is a Spanish writer, really a giant in Spanish literature, died in 1936. He's known for his prose fiction, his poetry, his theater, as well as his voluminous nonfiction writing, which includes essays, numerous essays, hundreds, not thousands of essays, newspaper articles, short pieces. He's also known as an important philosophical and religious thinker in Spain and a public intellectual. He was born in Bilbao in the Basque region of northern Spain, though he spent the majority of his life in the city of Salamanca, where he worked as a university professor, teaching Greek philology and eventually rising to be the rector, the president or chancellor of that university. He is a prominent member of Spain's Generación del 98, generation of 1898, a group that in many ways is similar in spirit and prominence to the Geração de 70 in Portugal, a group that was known for its critical re-examination of Spanish national identity during a period of crisis and change, and for the aesthetic and philosophical innovations that it introduced to Spanish literature. So there's a real affinity between these two groups, despite the fact that they operated approximately 2 decades apart in different countries. Some of Unamuno's works include experimental novels such as Niebla, translated to English as Mist and published in 1914, as well as his philosophical treatise Del Sentimiento Trágico de la Vida, or On the Tragic Sense of Life, published in 1912. As we'll see presently, he was also one of Spain's greatest Lusophiles, with hundreds of Portuguese books in his library, and someone who maintained a correspondence with numerous Portuguese writers and indeed befriended some, including Guerra Junqueiro. So I will turn screen sharing off and begin the talk. So here we go. In a 1908 travel sketch, later collected in his travel volume, Por Tierras de Portugal y de España, translated to English as Through Portuguese and Spanish Lands and published in 1911, Miguel de Unamuno asked the following question, and I'm going to read the majority of these quotes in English translation. What is it about Portugal, I ask, that attracts me so? What is it about this land, smiling and mild on the outside, tormented and tragic on the inside? I don't know, but each time I visit, I want to return all the more, end quote. Portuguese literature and culture exerted a formative, if sometimes overlooked, influence on Unamuno, who made at least 16 trips from Salamanca to Portugal over the course of his life. I've argued elsewhere, namely in my book, Iberianism in Crisis, which Diniz mentions in the introduction, that Unamuno's comparison of the Portuguese and Castilian landscapes, languages, literatures, and collective personalities, which he undertook in numerous essays, newspaper pieces, book chapters, and so forth, lies at the heart of his vision of Iberia as a dialectical unity. In other words, a space whose overarching geographic and civilizational commonalities would be identified or achieved by synthesizing its numerous regional particularities. And so he always saw Portugal as an integral part of the Iberian Peninsula, regardless of the fact that we all know, which is that Portugal and Spain are separate and distinct political entities. While Unamuno's lifelong engagement, not to say obsession with Spain and with Castile in particular, is well known, his lusophilia is less appreciated, at least outside the world of Portuguese studies. But Unamuno's investment in Portugal was, and I think is even today, exceptional in the context of Spanish literary culture, both during his time and really at any point, I think, in history. Unamuno corresponded with several Portuguese writers, with writers who were older than he, such as Guerra Junqueiro, contemporaries like Eugênio de Castro, Manuel Laranjeira, Teixeira de Pascoais, and a young Vitorino Nemésio. And he had hundreds of Portuguese titles in his library. Unamuno was particularly well-versed in 19th century Portuguese letters and was especially drawn to the iconoclastic generation of 1870. He routinely cited Portuguese authors, particularly the historian Oliveira Martins, who he termed, quote, the greatest of our psychologists, the writer who has most deeply understood the Iberian soul, as well as the poet Guerra Junqueiro, whom he considered a personal friend, along with Castro, Laranjeira, and Pascoais, with whom he was friendly as well. He cited writers such as Camilo Castelo Branco, Alexandre Clulano, Jorge Deus, de Queiroz, Antonio Nobre, and as I'll discuss tonight, Antero de Quental. Further, Unamuno argued that his fellow Spaniards should read Portuguese literature, and not in translation, but in the original language, because, and I quote, there is very little effort required to do this, and we owe it to our mother, whether we call her Iberia or Hispania, end quote. Unamuno devoted half of his volume, Por Tierras de Portugal y de España, which he initially conceived as a volume that would be devoted exclusively to Portugal, as well as various articles and poems to Portuguese places, writers, and topics. He also inserted Portuguese references into texts that apparently had nothing to do with Portugal, such as his rewriting of the story of Don Quixote, his Vida de Don Quixote de Sancho, published in 1905, which for one features citations from writers like Luis de Camões, Junqueiro, Queiroz, and Castro. Despite, again, having nothing apparently to do with Portugal or Portuguese literature, this, I think, illustrates the fact that these references were familiar to him and they were part of his intellectual vocabulary, so to speak. Moving beyond Unamuno's broad engagement with Portugal, the book chapter on which this talk is based addresses Unamuno's reading, or as I see it, productive misreading of Antero de Quental. My analysis centers on Unamuno's multifaceted engagement, his commentaries, his translations, and his poetic response to Quental's metaphysically inclined sonnets, which, as I stated earlier, revolutionized the sonnet form in Portugal, and which Unamuno praised for what he termed their, quote, depth of desperation and their, quote, intensity of religious anguish, end quote. Like Unamuno, I'll focus my comments today on two sonnets by Quental, Redenção, or Redemption, and Na Mão de Deus, In the Hand of God. In the first part of my book chapter, which I'll share tonight, I try to demonstrate how Unamuno unsuccessfully attempts to reconcile Quental's poetic descriptions of death as a form of liberation and of the individual's reabsorption in depth to the universal consciousness with his agonized faith in a personal God and Unamuno's New Testament-derived belief in humanity's redemption from sin and salvation by Jesus Christ. In the chapter's second part, which I won't have time to discuss, but which I'd be happy to discuss during questions and answers, I argue that while Unamuno may have misinterpreted Quental's position, his misreading was nonetheless productive for him in that it furnished him with an Iberian example of what he termed the tragic sense of life. Though I also contend in this second section that Unamuno's elevation of Quental to the status of tragic exemplar is still misplaced. The earliest reference to Quental I've found in Unamuno's work appears in an August 1904 newspaper article. The latest is in the sonnet entitled Antero de Quental, which he wrote in 1929. Unamuno, however, wrote the bulk of his prose and poetic reflections on Quental during an approximately 5-year period, running from 1908 through 1912. This is a crucial phase in his intellectual evolution in which he wrote an unpublished Tratado de Amor a Dios, or Treatise on God's Love, and its successor volume on the tragic sense of life. In his 1904 articles, Unamuno inserts the phrase vanidad de vanidad, todo es vanidad, or in English, vanity of vanities, all is vanity, from the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 1, verse 2. He also cites other verses from Ecclesiastes, and he inverts the phrase vanity of vanities, all is vanity on eschatological grounds, and I'm quoting from Unamuno's commentary. The wise and foolish man alike will be remembered because nothing lives without leaving its mark, and everything remains in one way or another deep within the guts, entrañas, of the universe. And when the universe receives its final killing blow, all of those notes that have been kept silent for centuries will sound from the depths. And from this reason, we should love life, and we should imbue the work we do on earth with happiness and hope, because all is plenitude and joy of the spirit, end quote. While Unamuno's account of human memory resounding as the universe receives its final killing blow doesn't explicitly invoke the biblical end of days, its reference to musical notes suggests the trumpets of revelation and the raising of the dead. Elsewhere, Unamuno ties the universe's fate to human redemption, writing in On the Tragic Sense of Life, quote, to believe in a living personal God, in an eternal universal consciousness that knows and loves us, is to believe that the universe exists for the individual. Further, to believe in God is first and foremost to hunger for God, to hunger after divinity, to feel its absence and emptiness, to want God to exist, and to want to safeguard the universe's human reason for being, end quote. In the same article, Unamuno cites Quental, who he terms a philosopher-poet, whose songs resound with melancholy in the melodious Portuguese language, end quote. And he transcribes Quental's famous two-sonnet sequence, Redenção, acknowledging the appeal of the idea of vanity and what for Unamuno was the ultimately erroneous notion that death should be accepted or even embraced. In his poem Redenção, Quental describes natural phenomena and the poetic voice as almas cativas, captive souls, that are redeemed, and he uses the term redeemed, as in the title, through death, which ends their shadowy earthly suffering and reabsorbs them into the universal consciousness. Quental's sonnet suggests a Platonic distinction between ideal forms and imperfect worldly copies, as well as the Buddhist ideal of nirvana in its presentation of death as a form of liberation from suffering. Quental's description of his thought as, quote, Hellenism crowned by Buddhism, end quote, as his friend Oliveira Martins related, is apropos here. Certain elements of Redenção also suggest the Catholicism in which Quental was raised. His description of visões crepusculares, crepuscular or dark visions, supplanted by a radiant clarity, recalls New Testament ideas of earthly existence as illusory or veiled, as in 1 Corinthians, for example, for now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then shall I know even as I am known, end quote. Though this may have more to do with the Pauline letters' debt to Platonism than it does to Quental's use of biblical metaphor. And Quental's image of voices rising from the earth also recalls Revelation, and his sonnet's title, Redenção, Redemption, if not the text itself, suggests Christ's redemption of original sin through crucifixion and death. Despite Unamuno's admiration for Quental, his belief in an essentially Christian notion of redemption conflicts with Quental's description of the individual's reincorporation in death, into the universal consciousness. This was an idea that deeply troubled Unamuno. Indeed, Unamuno expressed, quote, and I'm quoting from a critic, concern that perhaps his individual consciousness would be swallowed up when it returns to its source in the totality of consciousness, which is God. This is a possibility that Quental and Redenção seems to look upon as liberating and comforting. But Unamuno, in On the Tragic Sense of Life, rejects this beatific acceptance or embrace of death, which Quental presents in several sonnets. And Unamuno explains his objection here. A beatific vision, a loving contemplation of the soul being absorbed by God and lost within him, seems to me tantamount to the annihilation of the self and of perpetual torment, end quote. And in a 1900 article simply titled La Fe, Faith, Unamuno inveighs against religious abstraction and rationalization in favor of an effective irrational faith in, quote, the Christ of the Gospels, end quote, over belief in God as, quote, the great abstract idea. And he capitalizes idea here. And again, in Del Sentimiento Trágico, he argues for, quote, a feeling willful God, the projection toward the infinite of mankind's hunger for life, the hunger felt by real men of flesh and bone, end quote. In fact, Unamuno asserts that it is impossible to conceive of anything but a personal God, which for him would foreclose belief in an abstracted God as idea, as Quental seems to suggest is actually the case. If Unamuno fails to acknowledge his distance from Quental on these theological points, he hints at it in his comments on Quental's poetic style. Unamuno, despite his admiration for Quental, implies that Quental's verse suffers from an obtruseness or even inelegance and a degree of philosophical abstraction that find their religious or metaphysical analogs in his alleged reduction of God to, quote, abstract and logical principle, end quote. Indeed, Unamuno cautions that this approach, this abstraction of religious faith, leads to nihilism and even suicide, a warning that seems particularly prescient to the case of Quental, who, as I mentioned, died by self-inflicted gunshot in 1891. Even as Unamuno remarks on the desperation and religious anguish of Quental's poetry, he offers that it is, quote, there's something about it that is, quote, bony and hard, a conceptual and abstract element that often appears unadorned in his poetry. 1 year later, he would describe Quental's sonnets as, quote, full of formulas that speak to his reading of philosophy and would characterize them as deeply poetic but inartistic. Unamuno finds a workaround for his metaphysical misgivings, if not his stylistic critiques, in his interpretation of another sonnet by Quental, Na mão de Deus, in the hand of God. Here, the poetic voice imagines itself freed from earthly illusion and suffering, at peace in God's hand. Unamuno presents the poem, the final entry in Quental's collection of sonnets published in 1886, as a partial corrective to Redenção, in that Na mão de Deus appears to reintroduce to Quental's poetry a personal Judeo-Christian God that Unamuno would recognize. Once again, evoking Ecclesiastes, Unamuno insists on the transcendental meaning of human action and applies this to the case of the suffering Quental. He also affirms the ultimate redemption of the universe, tying it to the redemption of the individual. And he affirms that despite the suffering Quental experienced in life as a poet who battled lifelong depression, he too would be held, quote, in the right hand of God, end quote. The title of Quental's sonnet and its image of the dead held in God's hand remit to the Bible, and these references seem to provide the basis for Unamuno's claim that the progression from Redenção to Na mão de Deus shows Quental moving toward or returning to a personal God of the sort that he might recognize. Unamuno's remarks on Redenção on at least 2 other occasions. While his emphasis varies somewhat, these readings are united by their insistence that Quental's later sonnets affirm salvation by a personal God. Yet, as one critic observes, the mature Quental identified God not as an omniscient presence, but as a representation of the human aspiration toward perfection and plenitude. At the same time, while Quental rejected the existence of a personal Trinitarian God, he nonetheless, quote, hungered for the divine, end quote. And he described himself in an autobiographical letter published in 1887 as an espírito naturalmente religioso, naturally religious spirit. Further, as befits a writer raised in a Catholic milieu, Quental frequently used biblical images, concepts, and language in his writing, as we've seen. His poetry routinely refers to the crucified Christ, and he incorporates phrases taken from the Vulgate in Latin, for example. But as the critic Fernando Catroga notes, while for Quental, Christ was not the Son of God, he nonetheless served Quental as a potent prophetic symbol and representation of humanity's progress toward the good. The frequency with which Quental utilizes biblical images and language in his work may have caused Unamuno to confuse Quental's rhetoric and his religious longing with belief. Moving from rhetoric to religious imagery, Quental more than once describes Jesus and Christianity in general as steps in humanity's progressive march toward the ideal, a teleological view reflective of Quental's attraction to Hegelianism and other forms of historical idealism. For instance, in his sonnet Idea, the Idea, Quental describes a movement toward truth beyond Jesus and beyond a personal God. He locates truth not in the heavens, but in the universal consciousness. And at the conclusion of his famous speech, Causas da Decadência dos Povos Peninsulares, Causes of the Decline of the Peninsular Peoples, published in 1871, this is an important text in Quental's work, and one that curiously Unamuno never cites. Quental describes the birth of Christianity and the passing of the classical world in terms of, quote, an ideia desse novo mundo que impõe-se gradualmente ao mundo velho, converte-o, transforma-o. An idea of the new world that gradually imposes itself on, converts, and transforms the old world. Before Quental then states that the revolutionary ideal will in turn displace Christianity. As he puts it, Christianity was the revolution of the old world. Revolution is nothing more than Christianity of the new world. And Quental explains this in similar positions time and time again. Most succinctly, perhaps, in a May 1882 letter to Alberto Sampaio, in which he addresses his poem Na Mão de Deus, Quental writes, Não te assuste a palavra Deus, é símbolo. Don't let the word God scare you. He's a symbol, end quote. In a February 22nd, 1909 speech he delivered in the Spanish city of Valencia, Unamuno, or actually not city of Valencia, in the province of Valencia, Unamuno read his translation of Quental's Redenção, which he may have composed in Portugal in the summer of 1908. Rather than arguing that in Na Mão de Deus, Quental corrects Redenção, as he did in his 1904 article, here Unamuno contends that the Portuguese poet presents a sort of inchoate beatific vision of God, though with an expression that Unamuno described as confused and symbolic. Finally, in Del Sentimiento Trágico de la Vida, Unamuno cites Redenção to argue for humanity's projection of consciousness onto nature and against pantheism. And I'll quote a little bit from Unamuno here. The tragic Portuguese poet Antero de Quental imagined in two stupendous sonnets, which he titled Redemption, that there are spirits imprisoned not in atoms or ions or crystals, but as befits a poet in the sea, in the trees, in the forest, in the mountains, in the wind, in all material beings and forms, and that one day all of these beings, floating in the limbo of existence, will awaken to consciousness, and as pure thought will cast off their forms as pure illusions. It is this grandiose dream of a universal coming to consciousness, end quote. So in this speech, Unamuno seems to be defending Unamuno seems to be defending Quental from the specter of pantheism by contending that in his poem Redenção, Quental describes humanity's spiritualization of nature, affirms the primacy of human destiny, and therefore makes an implied argument for salvation by a personal God. But in point of fact, in an 1890 philosophical essay, Quental asserts something that's nearly the inverse, that humans, rather than being superior to nature, are bonded to it through a common aspiration or evolution toward liberty. While for Quental, the human aspiration to be free is common really to all of material existence, as he describes in a sonnet entitled Evolução, Evolution. Here, his argument takes a partial turn toward Unamuno by privileging humanity and postulating an ultimate end or meaning for the universe. This said, Quental undercuts Unamuno's interpretation of Redenção and Na Mão de Deus when he revisits the union of the individual and universal consciousness and identifies divinity not with God, but with what he terms the plenitude and perfection of being. So um up, Quental was deeply preoccupied with spiritual matters. That much is true. And his writing also continually drew on identifiably Christian ideas, symbols, and language, even as it also incorporated elements from Platonism, Buddhism, German idealism, and other sources. This said, Unamuno's attempts to present Quental's sonnets as affirming salvation by a personal Judeo-Christian God amount to a case of misreading, if not willful misinterpretation. Moving from prose to poetry, Unamuno published a volume in 1911 entitled Rosario de Sonetos Líricos, which he acknowledged in correspondence was heavily indebted to Antero de Quental. This volume features 2 sonnets that curiously share the exact same titles, albeit translated to Spanish, as 2 of Quental's most famous sonnets, Redención and En la mano de Dios. Now, to make it even more curious, Unamuno also translated Redención to Spanish as Redención, but here I'm not referring to the translation, but rather to an original work by Unamuno entitled Redención. Unamuno's account in this poem of redemption is again quite distinct from Quental, who, to remind you, in Redención, writes in the second person to describe death as redemptive. Here, Unamuno retains the use of the second person, but he places the onus on the individual to merit redemption, and he evokes the language of the Pauline letters to describe the primacy of faith over good works. Further, Unamuno urges the reader toward optimism, to reject sorrow, which he describes elsewhere as characteristic of Quental and as a deceiving, corrupting force. It's difficult not to see Unamuno's optimism here as a rejoinder to the pessimistic Quental, or perhaps as an attempted corrective that would bring the 2 into alignment. This is a common aspect of Unamuno's work when he really admires a writer, but finds that there's a sort of divergence of opinion between the 2. He agonizes and he tries to find a way to bring the 2 writers into alignment. And this sometimes risks a sort of willful misinterpretation or perhaps unconscious interpretation on Unamuno's part. Indeed, Unamuno appeared to grant himself a kind of permission to translate Quental so as to bring him into accord with his views in a note that he appended to his Spanish versions of Redención, in which he states that the 2 sonnets are, quote, traducidos a la letra y no en verso, translated for content and not in verse or not for style. In other words, he didn't maintain the original rhyme scheme. Given Unamuno's high degree of fidelity to the Portuguese original in this translation, accepting certain changes in punctuation, it appears that his distinction between letra and verso may have less to do with the mechanics of translation than with a presumed need that he felt to probe the poem's deeper significance, of course, as he determined that deeper significance, and to privilege that deeper meaning over Quental's apparent surface meaning. Perhaps Unamuno's confidence that he could read Quental beneath the surface of his poetic language helped him ignore the ample textual evidence in Quental that pointed to a conception of death and redemption that was at some remove from, if not in open conflict with, Unamuno's own ideas. In the case of Unamuno's poem En la mano de Dios, the connection to Quental's Na mão de Deus is even more explicit because Unamuno cites as his epigraph the verse Na mão de Deus na sua mão direita from Quental's poem, the opening line of that sonnet. Unamuno stakes out a similar position to the one that he expressed in Redención, whereas Na mão de Deus, which is narrated in the first person, Quental describes earthly life as illusory and painful and associates death with an end to suffering and with peace. Unamuno, writing in the second person singular, describes the individual in agony, a dying man struggling in body and mind to stay alive. In the sonnet's tercets, the deceased ultimately achieves tranquility, as occurs in Na mão de Deus, and somewhat like Quental's description of earth as a palacio encantado da ilusão, enchanted palace of illusion, Quental describes thought as a fuente de ilusiones, fount of illusions. However, Unamuno's references to the individual's struggle before succumbing to death implies that there's nobility in resisting death, and it also implies that it's natural to recoil at losing one's individuality in death. This position is squarely at odds with Quental's acceptance or even embrace of death, as he expressed in numerous poems, including the sonnet Nirvana, in which he again depicts the absorption of the individual into the universal consciousness and describes earthly life contemplated from the standpoint of death as, quote, a ilusão e o vazio universais, universal illusion and emptiness. And he has other poems, including the sonic sequence Elogio da Morte, Eulogy for Death, in which he writes of death as a liberating, pure force. Unamuno elaborates on all of these points in a final sonnet that I'm going to analyze entitled La Unión con Dios, Union with God, which makes an implied reference to Quental's Na mão de Deus and secondarily to his own La mano de Dios. In La Unión con Dios, As in La Mano de Dios, the poet's voice, or excuse me, the poetic voice's desire for union with God coexists with an obstinate desire to live. While the narrator ultimately identifies resistance as sinful, even satanic, he also implies that acquiescence a la Quental amounts to a kind of surrender, and that emotional struggle should accompany bodily agony. As we've seen in his readings of and poetic responses to Redenção and Na Mão de Deus, Unamuno attempts to bridge the gap between his and Quental's positions by arguing that Quental's poetic descriptions of death as liberation and of the relationship between the individual and universal consciousnesses are in fact inchoate representations of a New Testament-derived account of redemption by a personal God. In other words, he's arguing that Quental, using confusing or symbolic language, is somehow affirming Unamuno's argument in favor of a personal God, whereas it seems like the bulk of the textual evidence is pointing in precisely the opposite direction. Elsewhere, Unamuno takes the complementary step of affirming Quental's tragic bona fides, attempting unsuccessfully, to my mind, to transform Quental into an exemplar of what he would coin in one of his most famous works, the tragic sense of life. And this is the second part of the presentation that I'm not going to have time to get into, but I'll just kind of summarize a little bit what I talk about in the second part and try to connect it to the first part. So in the second part of my chapter, I begin by asking the question, why is Unamuno misreading Quental in this way? What's the point? Is he simply making a mistake? Or is there something more conscious, more self-conscious, more aware going on here on Unamuno's part? And I argue that it's unlikely that Unamuno, given his deep knowledge of religion, philosophy, the hundreds of Portuguese titles, including 5 books by Quental in his collection, simply misunderstood Quental. And that he somehow unintentionally repeated this misreading again and again over several texts published over an at least 25-year period, in which he referred repeatedly to Quental and analyzed his work. So I find that very unlikely. Rather, what I propose is that Unamuno's misreading has to be at least partially intentional and tied to something he does in Del Sentimiento Trágico de la Vida, which is to elevate Quental to the status of an exemplar of the tragic sense of life, both in general and in the Iberian context. And here it's curious that when Quental talks about the tragic sense of life and talks about this as something that is an intrinsic or particularly strong aspect of the Iberian character, he fails to come up with any real life Spanish examples of this tragic sense. He cites Don Quixote repeatedly, but he's a literary character, albeit one who's very real for Unamuno. And so Unamuno then has to depend on a Portuguese writer, Antero de Quental, to make the argument that the tragic sense of life is an inherently or especially Iberian phenomenon. But in order to do this, he has to define Quental as a tragic figure in the same way that Unamuno does. And this involves a kind of misreading that I argue is complementary to the misreading that Unamuno engages in when he analyzes Quental's poetry, particularly his poetry that sketches out a conception of life and death that, yes, has certain elements that are drawn from Catholicism, but that draws equally or perhaps even more so on classical ideas taken from Plato, as well as elements of Buddhism and the notion of the obliteration of the universal, of the individual within the universal consciousness, and that utilizes a language of Catholicism, but for essentially symbolic ends. So this is what I'm trying to do in the paper, showing how Unamuno, on the one hand, misreads Antero de Quental, but sees him as a necessary element of the tragic sense of life, which is really one of the intellectual cornerstones of his work. And this creates a need, I think, on the part of Unamuno to understand Quental in a way that would be coherent with his own intellectual project, despite the fact that I think on the merits, Quental and Unamuno are at some remove from one another on these questions of life and death and their conceptions of metaphysics and religious experience. More broadly, I think that it's notable as an illustration of, on the one hand, the depth of Unamuno's engagement with Portuguese literature, that he's so dependent on a Portuguese poet who's relatively little cited within Spanish verse, but whom he deeply admired, even as he misinterpreted, I think, certain elements of his worldview and as expressed in his poetry. And so it's important for us, I think, those of us who are scholars of Portuguese literature and or Spanish literature, to understand the roles that these figures play in the work of each of these literary traditions. In other words, to understand what people like Antero de Quental mean for Spanish writers, and the sort of the inverse, which is the symbolic value of a writer like Miguel de Unamuno for those Portuguese writers who were influenced by him, such as the poet and prose writer Miguel Torga, for example, whose pen name of Miguel Torga is a dual homage to Miguel de Cervantes and to Miguel de Unamuno. There are many other examples we could cite as well. So this is really an example of what fascinates me about literature in Portuguese and Spanish, which is the degree of interpenetration between these literary traditions, which sometimes I think we tend to think of as separate because they're composed in distinct languages, because of the history at times of tension between Portugal and Spain, and of the fact of Portugal's independence from Spain and Brazil's political separation and independence from its Spanish-speaking neighbors. So with that, I'll wrap up. And again, I apologize if at some point I lose my connection, but I'm eager to discuss and to have a dialogue.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. I mean, we could, of course, I think we could, of course, continue. I think we lost your image for a little bit there.
Oh, sorry.
Here we go. Here's Robert right there. Okay. So
I was trying to mute myself, but I got rid of it.
No, that's okay. Okay. So thank you so much, Professor Newcomb. It was fascinating. And indeed, it is interesting how, as you pointed there at the end, how sometimes we don't make those connections. That Iberia connection that lots of other writers, of course, have talked about and have worked on, including our own, as you very well know, our own Nobel, the only one so far, José Saramago, and of course the some of the influences of Unamuno in even our very Azorian Vitorino Nemesio, as we all know, Trinidad and all that, all the issues with that. So I would open up to all of you who are parts of the attendees. If you have any questions, please just type them in, or I can unmute you, whichever way you prefer. If you'd like to join the conversation, we'd be more than happy to bring you on, not just verbally, but also on video if you'd like that, or you can have any question put forth on chat. And I'll also check on, it's harder to check on Facebook because there's lots of different things going on that platform, but I'll also check if there are any questions also on Facebook as well. So those of you in the audience, will be more than happy to entertain any of the questions that you have or any thoughts on the presentation by Dr. Robert Newcomb. We appreciate it. Fascinating. And you said that your second chapter, of course, continues with this process, and hopefully we can get you back also to discuss that with a little bit more detail. Yes, I think that'll be fascinating to continue this correlation. So we're open to any questions if we have them. If we don't, we can maybe look at, as people get their questions, if you can share the screen and we look at that wonderful, some of those poems that you have.
Yeah, I can do that if you'd like. Let me just
yeah, it's just to make sure. We only have a few more minutes, but we'd love to have entertain any questions, of course, or any thoughts or any concerns anybody has. But we and I'll keep on checking the chat.
One thing I did want to share is this poem which Unamuno wrote, where he actually touches on not this one, on the Azores a bit,
interesting.
Which is a tribute to Antero de Quental, but which, unlike his other work, specifically identifies Quental with the Azores, which is an interesting kind of particularity. He talks about en Antero isloteño, nido de brumas, Azores, donde las algas dan flores y la mar engendra ensueño. He calls him a profeta congojoso de la Atlántida perdida, viejo mundo, nueva vida, de inacabable reposo. He makes reference to Namagideus here, de Dios en la mano diestra, and as well as Unamuno's sort of life of suffering and death. But it's interesting here that he connects this with that picture of the Azores, which is an aspect that that he hadn't really commented on previously in his work, but perhaps under the influence of the young Nemesio, who wrote to the elder writer Unamuno very early in his career and later in Unamuno's career, looking for inspiration and sharing his enthusiasm for Unamuno's way of viewing Iberian issues.
We have a question that maybe we can pose right now, and I think you can see it as well, from Professor Leopoldo, about does Unamuno, does he have anything to say about the causas da decadência dos povos peninsulares, famous Antero de Quental piece?
Right. You would think that the answer would be yes, given Unamuno's interest in inter-Iberian relations and in the political relationship between Portugal and Spain. But as far as I know, I have not found any reference to causas da decadência dos povos peninsulares. In his personal library, Quental had 5 volumes by, Unamuno had 5 volumes by Quental, all of which were poetry, 4 in Portuguese, and 1 was a Spanish translation of some of Quental's poems. And I haven't found any reference to Causas da Decadência. He makes one reference to a fragment that Quental wrote late in his life that was published in Teixeira de Pascoais' periodical A Águia, which he seems to have received as kind of a complimentary copy from Pascoais. And so he comes to that fragment through Pascoais, but I found no evidence that he independently read the more political or the sort of prose aspect of Quental's work. He really seems to be a fan specifically of Quental's poetry and interested in what Quental says about philosophy and religion through that poetry. Oh, I think you're muted, Diniz.
I am. I do that often. So thank you for mentioning that. I would continue on talking like if I wasn't muted. So again, thank you. Yeah, fascinating that it wasn't touched upon because, as you said, it is that is quite interesting.
Yeah.
If we have any other questions, fine. If not, we maybe can look at another poem or so.
Sure.
Because you have some.
Yeah. So here is this is Redenção, and it's a beautiful.
Yeah, it's just
beautiful poem. And you can see how Quental is animated by the idea that all of earthly existence has a kind of consciousness, and as Unamuno mentions, he calls out to the sea, vozes do mar, das árvores, do vento, quando às vezes num sonho doloroso me embala o vosso canto poderoso, eu julgo igual ao meu vosso tormento. It's interesting as well, since we've been talking about the Azorian dimension, that I actually have it right here, conveniently, John Kinsella's anthology of his bilingual anthology of Azorian poetry opens with poems by Quental, which I never really thought of as specifically Azorian or about the Azores, but Quental often refers to the ocean or to water and in his work, and he doesn't specifically locate it in an Azorian context, but it's interesting when it's put into an anthology of Azorian poetry, which is so often about the Azorian landscape, about the relationship between the Azorian people and the sea, that you can sort of read those poems as having this kind of insular dimension as well. And that's certainly a feature of Quental's representation of nature, that the primacy of the sea, which you see here as well.
There's also one other question. Can you speak more about Quental's Iberismo? Can you point us to some of his writings on this topic?
Absolutely. The two main texts where he talks about Iberianism are a political pamphlet that he wrote in 1868 entitled Portugal perante a Revolução da Espanha, Portugal confronted by the revolution in Spain, in which he reflects on the beginning of a political revolution which overthrew, would eventually result in the temporary, very temporary overthrow of the Spanish monarchy and the First Spanish Republic. He saw this as an example for Portugal and a way to disabuse Portuguese individuals of the notion that Spain had annexationist ideas and wanted to annex Portugal, and he thought at this young age that the two countries could adopt a republican, decentralized form of government together, and in that way, Portugal could join the other Iberian communities and both retain its political autonomy, but also be part of a larger entity. By the time he wrote Causas da Decadência dos Povos Peninsulares in 1871, he had become less confident in a specifically political solution to the Iberian question, but he still insisted on looking at the history of Portugal and the history of Spain as moving often in lockstep with one another, and characterizing the problems faced by late 19th century Portugal as a result of the Iberian Peninsula's abandonment over the centuries of certain progressive ideas that he rather paradoxically identified with medieval Portugal and medieval Spain, that would later, to his mind, be corrupted by empire, by the influence particularly of the Jesuit order, and by other aspects of early modernity.
Mm-hmm.
So those are the most important pieces of work.
Yeah. From another, first a comment and then a question, as I think you can see that one as well, Professor Newcomb, which is from first a comment, the way Unamuno sort of reduces Quental's work to his unique ontological solution to existential dilemmas seems to me great illustration of Bloom's argument on the anxiety of influence. And secondly, the question, what's the importance of bringing back the notion of Iberianism to address contemporary environmental issues? Very good question, obviously.
Well, I think to answer the second question first, I think if we define Iberianism very broadly as simply a concern with the place of Portugal within the Iberian Peninsula, or the fact that Spain does not occupy the entirety of that peninsula, environmental concerns become a case in point, because environmental crises do not know political boundaries. If you have a problem with wildfire in Portugal, it's highly likely that you have a problem of wildfire or drought in Spain as well. And of course, we know that rivers flow through both of these countries. And so I think that taking a kind of Iberia-wide or even European approach to these problems is necessary, and the return in many countries to a form of nationalist populism has many nefarious consequences, but one of those being the kind of shutting off of possibilities for dealing with transnational problems such as the environment. I think that I would agree with Andre that Harold Bloom's idea of the anxiety of influence is illustrated in the way that Unamuno struggles with and tends to distort Antero de Quental. And this is typical of many of Unamuno's readings. They're on the one hand very affectionate, but he tends to really work to bring these writers into alignment with his own views, even if those writers would disagree.
And again, from Professor Leopoldo, what do we learn from these dialogues between Unamuno and Quental that could help, kind of touch upon a little bit, Spain to come to terms with today's notions of separatism and integration?
Yeah, it's I think that there are several aspects of literary culture and the sorts of problems that we're facing Portugal and Spain during the late 19th century that are quite relevant to the early 20th century, particularly those problems that are clustered around the idea of crisis. The late 19th and early 20th century in Portugal and Spain were periods of almost existential threat to these countries in terms of political threats, economic decay, domestic instability, and crisis. These writers were continually aware that their countries were facing profound crisis, and they reacted with great creativity and openness to ideas that under normal circumstances would seem counterintuitive, if not anti-patriotic, such as Iberianism, in the case of the young Antero de Quental. And so I think that one thing that we see in moments of political crisis, whether we're talking about the sovereign debt crisis of the first decade of the 21st century in Spain and Portugal, and the ensuing periods of austerity, now leading into the return of a kind of a right populism, which is to a certain degree ascendant in Spain, and was on display in the very, very recent Portuguese presidential election, in the case of the Chega party and André Ventura. We see a kind of a shuffling of the political deck, in a sense, in these two countries, and the openness of more and more voters to new parties, new ideas, and solutions that seem counterintuitive or radical.
Okay, I think any other questions, please let us know. But we are certainly just about out of time, and I don't know, Professor Newcomb, if you can stop the share of the.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you so much. And so I wanted to thank everyone. If you do have another question, we do have another minute or two. We'd be more than happy to have Professor Newcomb, of course, answer it for you. If not, I want to thank all of you. I want to thank all of you that are joining us here, and all of you who have joined us in some wonderful comments on Facebook as well. I want to thank first and foremost, of course, Professor Robert Newcomb for this fascinating talk. And I'm very serious. We do have to have you back, but when we're not just virtual. Although we are going to, of course, continue with somewhat even when we come back to a new normal, we are going to have some feature of a virtual, or at least recording for posterity, because it's a way to get to reach many other people that cannot come to the university. But we'd love to have you back, if not the fall of 2021, for sure the spring of 2022. So you're going to have to make that promise here to everyone that we can get you to come from Davis to Fresno.
I would love to come, and I'd like to really commend you on the work that you and your partners are doing with the Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute. And it's wonderful to have this dialogue as institutions that, at least in terms of California geography, are neighbors to one another. And I think it's really gratifying for me to be able to engage with all of the really dynamic work that you're doing in Fresno and in the Central Valley around the Portuguese American community and Portuguese studies.
Thank you so much, and thank you. Thank you so much again for your talk. Thank you for fascinating, and thank all of you for being part of it. Thanks to FLAD, of course, for being the sponsor of the PBBI lecture series at Fresno State. And just a word of information for all of you joining us, that we have our next one on the 4th, where we'll be presenting a book by Portuguese American poet Sam Pereira called True North and Untrue You. And so join us at the same time. Again, thank you so much, Professor Newcomb.
Thank you.
And thanks to all of you for joining us. And everyone have a good night. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Take care.